Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 16th chapter in the book of Matthew. We're going to open with the 13th verse and take it all the way to the end. This chapter is 28 verses in length. We just want to briefly review what occurs before the Pharisees and Sadducees, the two otherwise mutually antagonistic majority sects in the Judaic religion at the time, approach the Messiah and demand a miracle or a sign, and he answers them saying, "A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." So that's an allusion to his resurrection. They wanted an immediate miracle, but miracles of the divine order are never manifest for the sake of publicity, awe, shock, or wonder. They are always and only for a greater purpose than to supplement the faithless people who need a miracle in order to believe, and they dismissed him because he wouldn't accommodate their request, and none of them quite knew what he meant by the sign of Jonah, but that is an allusion to their resurrection. As Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the fish, so too would the Son of Man spend 3 days in the grave, in the ground, and then rise up on the third day, much as Jonah would be spit out onto shore. Then he retreats with his disciples to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and he tells them to be mindful of, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And in Luke's version, we read that this is hypocrisy, and they fail to understand because they think leaven. They interpret that literally. Leaven is the yeast which gives rise to bread, but he's telling them not of literal bread, but of their doctrine, and so they finally come to an understanding and a realization of what he is. Then in the 13th verse we read, we're going to open with that. "Now when Yahshua came into the parts of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, 'Who do men say that the Son of Man is?'" Now the region of Caesarea Philippi ought not be confused with the city of Caesarea, which was constructed by Herod the Great in honor of his Roman patron, Augustus Caesar, but it was a region that was 25 miles to the north of Capernaum, which was the Messiah's base of ministerial operations. So it was in the region of Galilee, way to the north, and it was 150 miles north of Jerusalem, and it was a site and center of Baal worshiper. There was also temples to the Greek deity of Pan, and also Herod the Great constructed one to Caesar Augustus. So they were in a pagan epicenter within the Promised Land when he asked them the important question, "Who do men say that the Son of Man is?" Because there was a great variety of mystery as to his identity, and there were no shortage of messianic pretenders both before and after the real, authentic Messiah came. And they said, "Some John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." So John the Baptist, this was the opinion of Herod Antipas, the the Idumean son of the Herod dynasty who had jurisdiction over Galilee. He thought that John the Baptist, whom he had executed at his wife's behest reluctantly, but his daughter ultimately, her daughter seduced him into granting any wish he wanted, and so he knew that John spoke some truth, and he perceived that he was a prophet, but he made the deal up to half of his kingdom, and so he beheaded him, and he was regretfully so, or with reluctance, and he was convinced that John the Baptist had risen from the dead and was in the form of this mysterious man from Nazareth. And Elijah, now the Old Testament closes with the promise of the return of Elijah. That was actually John the Baptist who came in the power and the spirit of Elijah. We read in Luke 1:17. And Jeremiah, now many Jews, I believe it somewhere in the second book of Maccabees, there was a hope and expectation that Jeremiah would rise and return from the dead. But of course, he was none of these things. He was something greater. He was a prophet, but he was more than a prophet. And he said to them, "And you, who do you say that I am?" So he turns the question into a personal application. He investigates as to the variety of erroneous and popular opinions and projections and perceptions of who he is. Now he asks them directly, "Who do you say that I am?" And he's asking no one in particular. He is in the company of the 12, the disciples, and Simon Peter, who is the spokesman of the disciples, is often the one who answers. And Simon Peter answering said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living Elohim." So Peter had the correct confession, and a lot of the disciples were slow to realize that he was, in fact, the Messiah and that he was divine. He was the Son of the living Elohim, so he was Elohim himself. He was his son. He was sent by Yahweh the Father, and he has equal claim to the title Elohim as the Father who sent him, and also the Ruach Kadesh who he sent after him. But Peter answers correctly now. In one such instance, in the 8th chapter of this book, we read that they're on the Sea of Galilee and a terrible storm comes, and he says, "Peace be still." They say, "Master, we're going to perish." And he says, "Peace be still." So even at that time, and they said, "What manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" So even then, they did not have the full realization or revelation that he was divine. They thought he was an extraordinary man, but Peter has been revealed through the process of time. Now, the Messiah had never outright told him that he was divine, but a divine power above him had instilled in this. So the source of his revelation, as we read in the next verse, was not independent inquiry, but divine revelation. And Yahshua answered, said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in the heaven." So he received that revelation from the Father himself. He was not told this information from the Son. So Peter had a revelation from the Father. This was not an emotional response to a recent miracle. This was a sincere and studied answer to a prayer that he had about the man to whom he had been walking through. He correctly recognizes as the Son of the living Elohim. "And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I shall build my assembly, and the gates of the grave shall not overcome it." So Peter was the name he was given. His birth name was Simon, but Peter translates in Greek as rock. So he's the rock of the new assembly. And the assembly is the new community that's going to be gathered around him. He, at this point, did not intend to start a new religion, but one emerged around him nevertheless. And the assembly was the community around which, that is the name of the community which forms him, more commonly known as the church, in more familiar translation as the church. Now, the church is not a building, it is the people who gather and congregate in the building. So the church is not where the building is located, it is wherever the people who go to the building, when they leave the church building, they take the church with him. And the word assembly itself appears twice in the gospel, or 3 times rather, twice in Matthew 18:17. It only Matthew is the only one who references this, and the word appears 114 times total in the New Testament, 90 of which times are in reference to local assemblies. So there are 2 assemblies. There is the lowercase assembly, that's the local one, the one you belong to, and then there is the capital A assembly, that is the universal body of believers. And he tells Peter that he's the foundation of the assembly is going to be around the prophets and apostles, and the gates of the grave, alternately translated as Hades, that is the hell and death, will not prevail over it, will not overcome it. They will have no power over it because of the rock and found it. Now, he is the chief cornerstone of the church, so he himself is the rock. Peter is not the rock, and the Catholic Church uses this verse to justify its erroneous claim that Peter was the first bishop of Rome. Now, Peter preached at Pentecost, and he laid the foundation of the Roman proselytes who would carry the new faith to the central city in the Roman Empire. And he did write his Peter, 1 Peter 5:13 was written from Babylon. That was a reference to Rome. The early New Testament writers resorted to cryptic language because any explicit declaration against Rome could be tantamount to treason, so they referred to Babylon. John does the same thing in the book of Revelation. And I shall give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be, having been bound in the heavens, and whatever you loosen on earth shall be, having been loosened in the heaven. So this is alternately translated as the power to forgive and condemn, which many Catholics believe that power is vested in the Pope. The Pope doesn't have the power to forgive sins. That is an exclusively divine prerogative, and to claim it for any human is tantamount to blasphemy. When the Savior said, "Rise, your sins have been forgiven," that's what his Pharisaical detractors charged him with, of tantamount, a statement that was tantamount to blasphemy. But this is not the power or the authority, and the keys are what unlocks the mystery and the gates to the kingdom of heaven. But the power would be, it's not the power to determine who is forgiven and who is condemned. It's rather the authority, the delegated authority to announce that you can be forgiven or you can be condemned. Then he warned his disciples that they should say to no one that he is Yahshua, the Messiah. So at a moment when the commotion and controversy was threatening to erupt around any messianic pretender, there were no shortage of messianic pretenders both before him and after him. That the writings of Josephus attest to this phenomenon, but he wanted them to keep a lid on it. Now, certain things they were privileged, and they were instructed to keep it private. This was one of them. He did not need the news that he claimed to be the Messiah, because that would invite a host of troubles which would trap him and kill him premature to his time. He operated on a divine timetable. His hour had not yet come, and he did not want to do anything to hasten it, and nothing could hasten that like the claim that he was Messiah. From that time, Yahshua began to show to his disciples that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and to suffer much from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and to be raised again the third day. So Matthew is one of the synoptic gospels which follows the trajectory of Mark, which was the earliest chronologically written one, which traces his ministry from Galilee, leading to Jerusalem and culminating on the cross. And he does travel to Jerusalem for the sacred holiday of Passover. That comes in the 21st chapter of this book. But he tells them that he's going to suffer and be crucified and killed, but he's going to be raised on the third day. The disciples curiously omit that resurrection. They only hear the kill part, and Peter, being the spokesman, we read of how he responds in the next verse. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Be kind to yourself, Master. This shall not be to you." So Peter he was sincere and well-intentioned. He didn't want to see the man he loved and followed and called Master suffer or die. His hopes were on the living Elohim, and he completely missed the resurrection part. So coming from the correct, now he rebuked the Master in private, but the Master rebukes him. He who had just so recently given the correct confession of who he is would be sharply rebuked and had turned. So he was initially praised and exalted for his correct confession. Now he's going to call him Satan, of all things. But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for your thoughts are not those of Elohim, but those of men." So he tells him the same thing he tells Satan himself in Matthew 4:10, when Satan offers him the kingdoms of the earth in exchange for him bowing and kneeling. That's all he had to do, and they were his to give. But Satan offered a shortcut. The kingdom could not come without the suffering. The suffering had to precede the splendor. The cross had to come before the kingdom, and so there are no shortcuts. And as much as Peter would prefer that he would not die, this was the divine timetable. This was something Yahshua was cognizant of, that the Peter, who was walking, he was expressing the opinions of men, and those of men are closely connected to those of Satan. So he did not want him, but it would have to be nevertheless. Then Yahshua said to his disciples, "If anyone wants to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." So he's rebuked in private by Peter. He counter rebukes him. Then he addresses his disciples, the 12, the future apostles, and he tells them the conditions for discipleship, the demands of discipleship. And this separates the wheat from the chaff, the fair weather followers from the authentic ones who will follow him in any weather, fair or foul. Now, there are two types of faith: the fair weather faith, those who bless Yahweh only in as much as they prosper him, and the foul weather faith. These are the people who kind of lean on him when things are down, when things are low, and then when things get better, they desert him and abandon him. But we are instructed and admonished to have a faith which transcends all circumstances and all challenges, and to take up one's cross. Now the cross was a very real spectacle in the ancient first century. It was the mode by which Romans, it was not the ordinary means of capital punishment. It was reserved for traitors of the state and enemies thereof. And every apostle present would either be beheaded or crucified. Peter would be hung upside down. So this was a very literal meaning to them. If there was a cross in his life, there was going to be one in their life. Everyone except John escaped the martyr's death. But it doesn't, any self-sacrifice. Now, we are not everyone is called to the martyr's crown, but we are all called to sacrifice and to self-denial. Now that upsets and offends the natural man, because no one wants to deny themselves. The natural man considers itself and its own gratification and satisfaction preeminent. So self-denial is antithetical to the natural man, but that's what we have to be, and that's what we have to do in order to call ourselves followers of him. For whoever wants to save his life shall lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake shall find it. So if we covet, value, treasure, and esteem our own life on earth above all things else, then we will forfeit that which we most value in the afterlife when it counts much. This is a paradox. So whoever is willing to lose his life and surrender his self to the path of self-denial will find meaning in life through him. Our life comes from him. He is the source of life, not only abundant life on earth, but eternal life in heaven. So if we seek our life for its own sake, then we're going to forfeit that which we most treasure, value, and esteem in heaven. So there is a life after this next life. So on surface value, a paradox is a statement uniting two ostensibly irreconcilable polarities. So the death, now we all must die, but we can gain life after this death. That's what he's referring to. For what is a man profited if he gains all the world and loses his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his life? So all the treasure, all the prestige, all the power in the world is as nothing if we forfeit our soul, because the treasures of this earth are gonna perish with us, and we can take nothing with us. We can conquer the whole world, but if we lose our soul, it's not. No man can conquer or gain all the treasures of the world without compromising or sacrificing their own soul. And what shall a man give in exchange for his life? Now, he exchanged his own life, and the paradox is that by his death we gain life. So the price and the precious blood is the seal and the price of our salvation. We were purchased at the cross with a self-sacrifice, which we are called to emulate, but we can never duplicate. Now, the martyr's call, the atonement is more than a mere martyrdom. It is the martyrdom which justifies us eternally in the heavens. For the Son of Man is going to come in the esteem of his Father with his angels, and then he shall reward each according to his works. So this is a future yet to be determined prophecy. This is the second coming, when the Messiah returns in the splendor of his Father with the angels to conquer and violently eliminate the purveyors of evil from the earth, and he's going to reward everyone each according to his works. That is a reference to the final judgment. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death at all until they see the Son of Man coming in his reign. Now, this is interpreted by many skeptics as infallible proof that the Bible is fallacious, but it can mean one of several things: the kingdom of the coming of the kingdom. Now, in the next chapter, we read of the transfiguration. That's when they witness, or at least three of them. That's the three of them, because remember, he said some of them, not all of them. The two sons of Zebedee, James and John, and also Peter, were privy to the transfiguration, where he revealed his full splendor with in the company of Moses, representative of the law, and Elijah, representative of the prophets. And it can also mean the crucifixion and the resurrection, that that would have been all of them. But remember, he said some. And also Pentecost is another interpretation of that. That's the kingdom of the coming, where they announce the coming. So, but it's also the Son of Man coming, returning, will be a literal event when he literally comes sword in hand to violently eliminate evil from the presence of the earth and to conquer it for all time. So that is our blessed hope and most exalted expectation. I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.